Bom dia para você que é de bom dia, boa noite para você que é da boa noite, boa tarde se você acabou de chegar no YouTube recebendo mais uma notificação de um bate-papo Mayhem. E hoje a gente vai falar sobre o ritual de Abramelin. Então, se você assistiu a Dark Song, se você acha que tudo aquilo tem a ver, hoje a gente vai desmistificar um pouquinho, porque eu estou aqui com um psicólogo de Londres chamado Richard M., para entrevistar e falar um pouquinho sobre os aspectos psicológicos do Abramelin. Mas antes, você precisa ligar aqui, coloca subtitles e depois translate to português. E aí você vai conseguir ver as legendas tudo certinho. And now we are back to English. How are you, Richard?
I'm very well, thank you.
How's it going in London in this pandemic?
It's not been too bad for me so far, at least.
That's great. Well, the first question that we ask to our guests is about your path. Now, we talk a lot about the true will, and you had a great work, both in the study of the Abramelin and your work as a DJ and it's a drawing. How would I say that? It's an artist. Your Instagram is amazing.
Oh, thank you. So, yes, it's very kind.
So talk a little about all this stuff. So please.
Yeah, sure thing. I was always interested in the brain and like how the mind works, and I guess I became primarily interested in resilience, like how people manage to cope with things that are awful. One of the main books of that is called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. Yeah, certainly had a big influence. So yeah, I've just completed a BSc in psychology, focusing on psychology research. I'm also an artist, and I'm currently working in a robotics lab doing research. My special interests are in prejudice and mental resilience and psychedelic therapies. I also do campaign work around disability and social care. But the reason that I chose the Abramelin for this one project I was writing for was because in many ways we're doing a global Abramelin. You know, all of us are isolated for months at a time, and and stressed, and a lot of the physical aspects of the Abramelin are things that we've all been going through. And the interesting thing about the Abramelin is that it has aspects that really take a huge toll on the brain, but then it also has things that balance it out, that kind of help. So I was looking at the Abramelin in the same way that people have approached psychedelic therapies, in that there could be potential therapeutic aspects which people haven't particularly researched or looked at. And so yeah, it's a great model for looking at people surviving really stressful situations. So yeah, like for this project, I interviewed multiple practitioners all over the world to figure out the experience of it and what it felt like and the challenges that it posed for them. There are no studies about the Abramelin in science at all. And because I didn't have funding to do an actual, I couldn't just pay people to do it or follow people. This wasn't really a full research project. It was more just an essay that I was researching. So what I did was I broke the Abramelin down into different parts and then looked at at similarities, studies on various different aspects. So the social isolation or the different plants used and that sort of thing.
The first question that I had to ask you is, what is the Abramelin?
Right. So the Abramelin is a I can get to that, but essentially it's a magical ritual whose goal is to to have knowledge and conversation of one's holy guardian angel. It's sort of the earliest translation we have comes from Germany, about 500 years ago, but the text itself claims to be significantly older. But yeah, like I can't really talk about the historicity of it in much detail. I've primarily focused on the effects that it has on the brain.
All right.
But yeah, I do have a whole. I can give sort of the top hits of the essay initially now, if you'd like.
Yeah, it's very important to put to our listeners that you're a man of science and not a wizard and not a magician. And that's important because I interviewed some magicians like Ramses Dukes and Frater RC and several others that did the Abramelin, and you gave me their contacts. And they talked about that. So I will put the links in down here, and you can see what the Abramelin is from a wizard mage perspective. And today we'll talk about the psychiatrics and psychology of the Abramelin, right?
Yes, of course. Now, I mean, it might sound to some viewers like I'm here to to disprove aspects of it, and that really isn't my intention. My interest wasn't whether the angel was real or not, or whether people really experienced the angel or not. That's kind of besides the point of, I was looking primarily at, just the effects that the physical aspects of the ritual have on the brain, and I can't talk whatsoever to anything beyond that. And so haven't even speculated.
All right. So you're the man.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I guess it's common for spiritual practices to have a range of elements that are likely to lead to a change in consciousness. I don't mean earth, wind, and fire. Elements of like a lot of magical practices or religious rituals will use pain, or drumming, or consuming psychoactive plants to enter these altered states of consciousness, or journeying to the spirit world. And one of the things that's particularly interesting about the Abramelin is just the huge range that it has. Like, often practices will have one or two, but this actually it's absolutely packed full of them. Although pain is one of the ones that it's one of the few that it doesn't have. And of the research that I did, and speaking to people who've done it, and in the records of the ones who practiced it, it's extremely challenging to do the ritual. It leaves people feeling physically and mentally wrecked, but then it also gives them access to experiences of transcendental joy and bliss. So yeah, I mean, from the perspective of a psychologist, it's an absolutely fascinating ritual to explore. Of course, yeah, with science, I can't tell you whether something is true or not true. I can only tell you the probability of something being true. So I'm not here to take away anyone's beliefs or alter things. I'm only interested in the effects on the brain, as I said. So one of the areas of the brain that is particularly affected by the Abramelin is the default mode network. And I'm going to be mentioning this quite a lot, but basically it's involved in like self-reflection and your sense of self. And it's one of, in depression, it's highly activated because people are thinking about themselves all the time. It's all all this, all that, and self-related cognition. And one of the interesting things in its relation to psychedelic therapies is that the default mode network is one of the things that's disrupted by, say, the use of psilocybin mushrooms. But it's, a lot of the practices in the Abramelin operate on the default mode network. And one of the other key areas is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA. I'll just be calling it the HPA, which is an endocrine system for the management of stress. The ritual is extremely stressful, both in terms of like short-term acute stress and like long-term like chronic stress. But we'll go into a bit more detail as to the effects that this has on the brain. So yeah, one of the things which I'll talk about later, and this links back to the use of sacred plants, is that there is a potential translation difference of opinion because these are very old texts. Yeah, there is a possibility, or some people think that the plant cassia mentioned in the Abramelin is actually better translated as cannabis. I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not a historian, so I can't comment on that directly. But we'll look at that. I haven't gone into the chemistry of how cannabis affects the brain, because I kind of assume that's just generally known, and because that isn't an accepted translation more generally. But yeah, so the Abramelin is a very grueling ritual, and it involves social isolation, sleep deprivation, and prayer for 18 months. And then in the final 7 days, there's fasting, both of food and water, and the use of psychoactive plants. And at the end of those 7 days, that is when the angel is said to appear to the practitioner. Yeah, so the Abramelin, yeah, the first manuscript we have was written in 1458. I understand that even at the time it was, although at least the book claims that to be significantly older. Supposedly someone went to Egypt and found a practitioner who then passed on the knowledge. It seems to be a mix of a lot of different like magical practices kind of blended. There is a lot of Kabbalah in there, and a lot of sort of magic number squares. Magic number squares are actually an ancient practice we can trace probably about to 1000 BC. There's the use of sort of magic number squares in China. And a lot of Chinese herbs are actually used in the Abramelin. And some of, even today, they're used for people who go and do prayer up a mountain and fast. Will actually use some of the similar plants. So yeah, while the first translation of the manuscript is in Europe, and yeah, I'm not a historian, so please don't trust my facts on this particular section. Yeah, like it does have practices from many different cultures, and many of them very ancient also. So yeah, like one of the primary things that led me to the Abramelin is that it's the one thing I knew about it was that it involved long-term social isolation. And obviously living in the pandemic, as we all have, yeah, in many ways we've all been going through this global Abramelin, and it's been, you know, extremely stressful for a lot of people. And people have been learning about the effects of social isolation, you know, firsthand. So I can now go into the detail of the effects of social isolation on the brain. So social isolation is primarily related to the HPA axis and the stress response. And yeah, obviously in the Abramelin, people are isolated for 18 months. And you technically are allowed to have servants or a partner for some of that time. But I mean, if you're following the strictest possible interpretation, it's no other people whatsoever. But yeah, the Abramelin is fairly flexible in terms of its interpretation. And most of the people I spoke to weren't entirely alone for a lot of the time that they attempted it. I think it's quite hard to do in the modern day. But yeah, so social isolation is associated with an increased risk of death by 60 to 70% from all causes of possible death. So it really isn't good for us, for our bodies at any level. Also, like having good, strong social connections, being connected to other people, it gives us a lot of it increases our resilience to stress. Basically, we're able to cope with a lot more when we know that we're supported by people, and being socially isolated kind of conversely makes us a lot more vulnerable to stress. and that's all related to the HPA axis. So social connection will suppress the HPA axis, which kind of relaxes you and stops the effects, the negative effects of stress on your body. But yeah, long-term social isolation can affect your cognition and your memory and your fear responses. It can also disturb your sleep. You start to lose emotional control. So you'll have, you can flip from positive to negative feelings very quickly, or you can have negative thoughts which just go around and around your head and you just can't control them. So in many ways, a lot of the regulation of emotion is buffeted by kind of interacting with other people. And once you lose that, things start to become a lot more chaotic. Yeah, it's associated with high levels of psychological distress. But there's some other interesting effects, because isolation can actually make you more religious also. And that's quite interesting, because religiosity can actually help to moderate some of the effects of social isolation on well-being. There could be any number of ways that this works. One of the things that I found, and I'll touch on this later, is that praying to an entity or a god, in many ways, it's like talking to, in terms of, as far as the brain is concerned, it's like talking to another person. So it can help sort of make your brain think that it is communicating with other humans, and so that can actually help to buffer your stress.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
I'm thinking here because in my point of view, I witness like 3 different stages in the Abramelin. You have the Camarinha that we talked about, that is 21 days and you're isolated like in a cell, and it's very religious, and you pray every day, every minute, and etc. And then there's the Abramelin that's 6 months, and you don't have to be so rigid, and you can talk to some people. And then there's the pandemic that is a year and a half, and you can talk to a lot of people, but the results are quite the same. This is more compressed or more expanded. But to the mind, what happens to our minds?
Yeah, well, depending on which translation you're working from, the Abramelin is either 6 or 18 months. The later translation, which I think is more generally accepted, is 18. The other thing that the second translation adds is an element of Goetia, where once you have the guardian angel on board, you then use its power or assistance to summon and bind demons. But I didn't particularly look into those aspects, but I do know that was one of the primary differences in the translations, and that's why a lot of people have a problem with the second translation, which is 18 months and includes the Goetia elements.
I know that we want to go too deep in the fascism and authoritarianism aspect, but the Abramelin, since it makes its practitioner more religious, and we are all, as a global saying, into this new Abramelin, do you realize that we are getting more, not fascist, but authoritarianism? We are delivering more and more power to the authorities. And the practitioner of the Abramelin is delivering all his power to the sacred angel.
Yeah, so I touch on this a little bit later, but essentially, when we're stressed, we look for a feeling of control. Whether that's something, things that give us comfort and control, and religiosity is absolutely a part of that. I do think that this causing additional stress has definitely made people, well, it depends how you define religion, because a lot of people have found similar things in conspiracy theories which aren't religious, and they found a lot of other, or following leaders who just tell them what they want to hear, because it makes them feel safe. So yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I do touch on that a little bit more in a bit. So I figured out that sleep deprivation was also quite a large. Well, this one's actually interesting because depending where you're doing the Abramelin on Earth, it'll have different effects on your sleep deprivation. So if you're near the equator, like in Brazil, you obviously don't have that much variance between of the length of the day in summer and winter. So yeah, I should probably back this up a little bit. So the prayers you do 3 times a day, sunrise and sunset, and in the middle of the day, and which means that you have to be awake, and you do prayers for like an hour. And in Europe, if you do it in summer, the nights are only 6 hours long. So yeah, like if you're doing the Abramelin in Europe, you're going to get sleep deprivation, which will be chronic the whole way through the summer. And it's like even small amounts of sleep deprivation can actually cause can start interfering with how you produce memories. So it can even create completely false memories, which is quite interesting. One of the other things that sleep deprivation does is it allows the accretion of amyloid B plaques in your brain. And this will come up a little bit later, so we're going to put a pin in that. But essentially, amyloid B plaques are things which when they start to gather in your brain, and they essentially cause dementia. So yeah, even sort of when we sleep, our brain cleans out the plaques as much as it can. But obviously, when you're sleep deprived, it's not cleaning them out, and so they start to accrete, and that can start to cause memory problems and false memories. And it also takes away your ability to suppress unwanted thoughts and makes your emotions a lot more chaotic. So now we've seen at least 2 elements of it, which are going to make your emotions a lot less controllable, a lot less yours, and give you a lot less control over your own mind. So meditation has actually been shown to reduce false memory effects. And you could argue that some of the prayer-based elements of the Abramelin might actually help to counter some of the effects of sleep disruption. So I can talk about prayer in a little bit more detail if you'd like. So yeah, in the Abramelin, you do these, and yeah, I'm not too sure on the pronunciation, so please don't hold me to that. You do the all 150 Psalms of the Book of Psalms twice a week. You read through those, which I mean that's going to take up a huge chunk of your time. In addition to doing sort of unstructured prayer at morning and at sunset, and at sunrise, sunset, and at lunch. But there isn't any specific guide for how long it takes necessarily, or what it is that you should be doing during that prayer, but a lot of it is quite penitent in that people are doing a lot of confession. I'll touch on that on a little bit. So yeah, I already talked about how prayer activates the same parts of the brain that activate when you talk to another person. So like it still helps you exercise like the parts of your brain which would be languishing otherwise, if you're completely isolated. So yeah, I mean, right now talking to you, I'm activating the same part of the brain that I would be doing if I was talking to if I was doing prayer or talking to another person, which is it's quite interesting. Yeah, where did I
It
get
has the same effect as that movies with Tom Hanks, that he's in an island, isolated, and he's talking to the ball. It is the same, more or less the same idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Like it's a thing.
You can talk to God, or you can talk to your volleyball.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you're talking to sort of another entity, you're still exercising that part of your brain, and it's helping you not go too mad. Right. So even though I'm not particularly religious, I mean, I would consider doing prayers during the lockdown as a way to help one's well-being. probably,
Right.
especially if they're meditative. So like, because my background is primarily concerned with well-being, I would probably recommend something like the compassion and mindfulness exercises that Chris Germer does. I can put a link to that in the doobly-doo.
Great.
Let's write that out. Germer. Yeah, so essentially both compassion and mindfulness have their own unique benefits on the brain for helping you buffer stress, and they're really good, and everyone should do them. But I'm not a doctor, and no one should take any of my advice. Also, yeah, everyone thinks that sort of mindfulness is this wonderful thing everyone should do, but it does actually have its own risks that people don't talk about, because it trains you to focus. It increases your ability to focus. If you have a tendency for negative ideation, thinking negative thoughts, it can lead you to focus on your negative thoughts even more. So mindfulness actually has its own set of risks, which a lot of people don't talk about, and yeah, should be talked about more, I think. Yeah, so one of the aspects in the Abramelin related to prayer is confession. And obviously, with confession, you confess your sins. You're probably fairly familiar with confession. But because you're focusing on your own flaws and being open with them with God, who can see everything in this context, and because your emotions are now uncontrolled, when you start to feel negatively about yourself, you're not going to be able to stop yourself feeling that way, and the amount of emotionality is going to be exaggerated. So you're going to be feeling a lot more negative than you otherwise would. And while prayer in general has been shown to have beneficial effects on the brain, confessional prayer actually has been shown to have some quite negative effects. Yeah, so and is associated with decreased well-being in general. So yeah, I mean, related to prayer is the practice of fasting, which happens in many religious traditions, and is also, I mean, even yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about the Abramelin, which I didn't really touch on earlier, is that it's essentially like a transitional fossil. It's halfway between the sort of the solitary practitioner sort of shamanism and sort of modern organized religion. It's kind of something kind of in between. It has elements of sort of some very raw, like shamanistic elements, but then some things which ended up being refined into more more well-known and more traditional religious aspects. But it's interesting because it has elements of both. So back to fasting. Avoiding food and water is obviously, it can be quite bad for you, particularly water fasting. And if you were to follow the instructions of the Abramelin, in their entirety, there'd be some very negative effects, particularly from this aspect, and particularly from water fasting. So every person I interviewed ignored the water fasting element. So they wouldn't eat food, but they'd still drink water. And I mean, if you were to not drink water for 7 days, you would be dead at about day 2, probably, and you'd probably be suffering permanent neurological damage even after a day or 2, quite frankly. So I definitely don't recommend anyone does that. But yeah, like fasting with food, it decreases your default mode network activity, which is the thing we mentioned earlier, the thing that makes you think about yourself, and thoughts become a lot simpler and less complex and calmer. And again, you start to lose emotional regulation. And obviously that's a theme that keeps coming up, is the loss of emotional regulation with all of these practices.
This loss of emotional regulation we are seeing in the everyday, especially in poor countries like Brazil, that several people lose their jobs. And in the very poor areas, they are fasting against their will. because they have no food. So if with schools that are closed, our children, they do not have the here in Brazil, the poor kids, they have lunch at school. So many parents send their kids to school so they can eat something. And without schools, these kids are starving. So I believe in the small children, and these effects that you said, that emotional disbalance are even worse.
Oh yeah, and I mean in the developing brain, I mean there's no way the child is going to learn on an empty stomach, and it could have any number of sort of negative effects as the brain develops. You know, who knows like what effects it could have on them when they're adults. You know, it could be increased rates of depression, anxiety, yeah, sort of cognitive problems. Yeah, that's an awful thing to hear is happening. I'm so sorry.
We are terrible. We are suffering from fascism, and I believe they are connected. The people are beginning to, they idolize these fascists and these godlike persons in politics. And I believe that there is a relation. And from our talks in the WhatsApp and stuff, and the book that you recommended me, and I saw that here is actually happening here in the poor country. In Brazil, I believe it's more, its strength is very powerful, because people here, they are isolated. The discussions in the social media here in Brazil, they are out of the scale. So people completely lost their temper, and they do not argue anymore. They just fight. And it increasingly, perceptibly, it's becoming very, I believe we're quite at the verge of civil war here. And that's what you said. It matches perfectly what we can see in our day-to-day reality. The long-time effects of the Abramelin, but it's Abramelin in non-magic or religious people, in the common average Joe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's terrifying, because I mean the whole point of the Abramelin is that it's extremely structured. So you're doing these things which are driving you to madness, but then you're doing it within a framework which is making it a controlled descent. And obviously if you're doing just the things that drive you to the madness without the elements that control it, and you know, and take you through at a pace that stops your mind from breaking completely, I mean, yeah, who knows where things could go. But yeah, I mean on the topic of authoritarianism, I mean the fascism, I don't really find a useful word, because no one really knows what it means, and everyone has lots of competing definitions. But I mean, authoritarianism is something that is quite well defined, and is something you see in many places. And in terms of I mean, I don't really know what's been happening in the world. I haven't been watching the news. I found it all too depressing, so I just stopped, which is selfish. But yeah, it's been a hell of a year for me as well. And yeah, so from a psychological research point of view, the book that I would recommend is The Authoritarians by Robert Altmaier, which is free online. He reads it out in English, and he also has an ebook of it, which is free in his website. He thought it was so important for the world to know this information that he put his life's work out for free. And considering how dark the subject matter is, it's amazingly well written and funny.
Like, I've read it, it's scary. Para vocês que estão assistindo em português, o link está aqui embaixo na descrição do vídeo. I will put the link in the description of the video.
Yeah. So going back to the elements that can kind of help you control the descent, I'd like to talk a bit about the plants and in the incense and in the holy oil. So I actually have a little sample of the holy anointing oil. This one doesn't have cannabis in it, I should point out. But essentially, it's almost completely identical to the oil from the Old Testament. So it's often called Exodus oil, and it's a lot of religious traditions still use it to do an anointing. it's hard to describe. It's a wonderful smell, kind of woody and mysterious, and just yeah, quite lovely. I bought the oil specifically so I could have a sense of the experience while I was researching it, just a little taste. Although I didn't actually anoint myself with it. As I was doing the research on some of the components, I was like, there really are some like some very toxic plants on here, which definitely affect the nerves in the brain. So yeah, in the oil, there's myrrh, cinnamon, and calamus. I think there's also cassia, but I don't think I went into cassia in much detail. And yeah, the cassia was the one which was mistranslated as cannabis, although maybe that, yeah. And we have found, so as I say, this oil is taken from Exodus, and there are some historians like Danny Nemu, who does this talk about drugs in the Bible. He's actually a great person to have on the show. I'm sure he'd love to do it as well. Reverend Danny Nemu. And he can tell you about it. But yeah, essentially they found evidence at some holy sites of cannabis use alongside frankincense as a in Israel. So like, as this oil is from the Old Testament, and they are a lot of the incenses are quite similar to ones from that region. I mean, it isn't that much of a stretch that cannabis might have been the intended use included in the Abramelin. Of course, I wouldn't recommend it as it is illegal, although many of the practitioners who have done the Abramelin that I spoke to did admit to using it, although they were all living in countries where it was perfectly legal also, I should point out. So it's got myrrh in it, and myrrh has this stuff called boswellic acid, which actually enhances your cognition and like protects your nerves, and has anti-inflammatory properties. Like, one of the things I kept thinking when I was researching the oil is that a lot of it is surprisingly medicinal, and would probably be quite effective as like a local painkiller. And almost everything in it also has sort of antibacterial, antiviral effects. So I imagine, like, if you're in the desert and you have a paper cut and you put this oil on it, I imagine, you wouldn't die of a horrible infection, and it might actually help with the healing. So it literally would be, life-saving, healing, magical oil, in a time where, even a small injury could get infected and kill you. So it also has cinnamon in it, which actually helps to stabilize blood sugar, which can also stabilize your mood, and also stops you from getting too hungry while fasting. So you can kind of like, stretch out your glycemic curve. And it can also, it suppresses hunger and also can reduce some of the fatigue that you would feel. So the calamus in it, I think it's called Calamus acorus. That's been it's extremely toxic. It's used as an insecticide. It's been used in traditional medicine as a sedative, as an antipsychotic, and like, it would probably help offset some of the emotional intensity and the memory disruption that some of the other things might be causing. So like, it's interesting seeing how the different aspects of the Abramelin kind of counterbalance each other. Something that occurred to me. So in addition to the oil, there's also an incense, which is agar wood and frankincense, both of which have traditionally been used in a lot of religious magical incenses. Both of them act on the GABAergic system, which is essentially the same brain system which is related to stuff like Valium. So it's kind of a sedative with hypnotic effects, and it sort of decreases anxiety and depression. And I mean, you would be during the and I mean, it's all very well saying that these things would be protective for everything else that's happening, but really, you'd be doing 18 months of all those other things I've just described. Although the fasting is only in the final 7 days, and yeah, you'd only be using these plants in the final 7 days. Also, so it isn't that they would protect you the whole time. It's more just like towards the end, they might kind of keep you just sane enough to complete the work that you're trying to do. But it really is, I mean, the Abramelin is extreme. It really is a practice on the knife edge. Yeah, and I mentioned cannabis briefly already. Yeah, so all of these, well, most of these also related to stress, which is related to the HPA axis, and like chronic long-term stress is terrible, not just for your brain, but also for your body. And the sleep disruption and the social isolation are going to be causing like long-term chronic stress. And that's going to definitely sort of, yeah, it affects, again, emotional regulation. And yeah, so like you can really start to see how people can experience the bliss and the horror in the reports that people have made of doing the Abramelin. It really is something that becomes quite intense.
And in a way, we maybe have these effects in the major population in the world. If this pandemic extends more, then there's this new virus, the Cepa, the Indian new one, and then you have a lockdown again. I don't know if you are in lockdown again in London. I read something.
Yeah, they've just extended it.
Here in Brazil, we were never in lockdown because the population, we have a president that he does not believe in the virus. He's a negationist and a conspiracy theorist and theocratic. And the population, they're going to parties and everything. And we have one of the highest toll deaths in the world. So here is like hell, actually. And I don't believe we will escape from this thing that you said, this Abramelin that we are passing through in the next, I believe, 1 or 2 years. So what do you think the effect will be?
Well, I mean, as I've said, like obviously with the pandemic, there's obviously people have been talking about the first, second, and third wave in terms of waves of the virus, but actually, in many ways, the first wave is the virus itself, and of the people who die from the virus. The second wave is all the deaths that happen because of the virus, but not directly related to it. So because the virus is taking up so much time, people aren't seeing doctors. They aren't, if they have a heart problem, they might not go see their doctor about it and just try and treat it at home. So there's a whole lot of deaths happening, not directly caused by the virus, but related to it. But there's going to be a third wave, which is going to be all of the psychic trauma from all of the death that people have seen and all of the awful things that have been happening as a result. And there's absolutely going to be a huge number of people with, mental health problems, a lot more than before, probably that it's going to need treatment for years. Yeah, there isn't a country in the world that really has proper support for, mental health. And hopefully that's something that people will work towards building. That's one of the things that I find quite exciting about psychedelic research is the sheer potential of some of the results. So a lot of people have been talking about using MDMA to heal trauma. And a lot of PTSD, the current treatments are about learning to live with the trauma. But this actually seems to be able to help people process the experiences almost completely and like return back to their lives. And some of the results we're seeing from the psilocybin therapies for everything from depression to addiction to anxiety is just the results are incredible. So yeah, and these are both fast-tracked for to be rolled out as treatments, at least in America, probably within the next year or so, which is very exciting. Like we're approaching a very exciting time for therapies, at least in places where they'll be available. In Europe, because these substances are largely illegal, it makes researching them with government approval very expensive. So what would have with psilocybin, for example, what would have a single dose has a street value of, I don't know, £10. I don't know what that would be in. But
it's a lot here.
Yeah, so like say like $15 is the street value, but the in order to do that within a research framework with government approval is £20,000, which would be about 30,000 American, I assume. I'm not an economist, so don't call me on the exact. But yeah, it's incredibly expensive, and a lot of that is mostly to do because because of government regulation of these areas. But I think we're getting to the point where the results are undeniable, just how beneficial these things are going to be. There's still a lot that's unknown. There's still a lot of risks that we don't know about. And it's very important for people to know that it isn't just taking the substances like with antidepressants. It's the critical part of the therapy is the context. And so they're there to be combined with a therapy. You can't just take the substances and expect to be healed. They sort of put the brain into a state that's a lot more plastic. And it's what you do with that plasticity in the form of therapy that is beneficial. It isn't just the substances alone. And yeah, they could have all sorts of side effects, particularly if people are vulnerable to schizophrenia. But there's just so much that we don't know because it's been so hard to do research. But there is another YouTube channel. I don't know if I can plug that. My professor has the largest psychedelic research conference in the world, and I can give you the link for that. Breaking Convention.
Great.
And they've got sort of people giving lectures about it from all over the world. Yeah, some of it's scientific, some of it art related. It's really quite wonderful. So yeah, like if I can return back to the Abramelin. One of the areas that psilocybin mushrooms affect is the default mode network, the sort of the sense of self, and it just disrupts that. It's to the point where you experience your sense of self not as you, as your body, or as your political or sporting affiliations or like tribal affiliations. You essentially, your sense of self just becomes dissolved. You become one with all life, with all humanity, with the universe, kind of thing. And that's your default mode network just kind of dissolving for a temporary time, which is interesting because with depression it becomes highly activated and very, very centralized. And so this essentially has the opposite effect, which is quite interesting. And yeah, so before I talk about psychedelics in a bit more detail, I'm going to talk about what might be some of the long-term effects of the Abramelin. And yeah, this kind of ties into the long-term effects that we were talking about. So, and this is purely from reports. Obviously, there is no studies in the Abramelin. So people have reported sort of ongoing feelings of bliss and ego dissolution as a result of the Abramelin operation. People have also reported improved self-discipline and sort of self-knowledge, and their ability to manage stress has actually improved. And they've also experienced like a feeling more connected with humanity, and like a renewed sense of their own identity. So yeah, I mean, this all ties in quite well with its effects on default mode network activation, I would say. But everyone experiences the Abramelin differently. So some people will have vivid visions of the angel. Some will have a whispered voice or just a gentle sense of a presence. And this actually ties into a psychological construct which is actually quite well understood, which is something called absorption. And absorption is essentially how vividly you experience things. So people with absorption often report a lot of supernatural experiences. Their dreams tend to be a lot more vivid. They often have, to the point of not being able to tell the difference between sort of dreams and reality. When they pray, they're much more likely to report hearing God speak back to them with an actual human, well, in an actual voice. So people high on absorption tend to have much more vivid experiences, not just of life, but also of internal experiences as well. And so people higher on absorption are probably more likely to experience some of the more vivid parts reported in the Abramelin, and that might explain why people have sort of different outcomes from it. But one of the other potential long-term effects, and this is pure speculation because again, there's no studies on the Abramelin, but with psilocybin and possibly related to the default mode network dysregulation, is that the personality trait for openness to experience is increased for at least a year. And openness to experience, it's also been found to be higher in people who consider themselves to be spirit mediums. And yeah, so openness to experience is actually quite interesting. I wrote another paper about that because it has mixed effects on happiness, depending on how you measure happiness. So if you measure happiness like in the hedonic sense, so like hedonism, you know, like wanting, having pleasurable experiences and avoiding unpleasant experiences, then openness to experience doesn't really affect happiness, because while you're more open to pleasant experiences, because you're more open, you're also going to have more negative ones as well. So it doesn't actually improve your overall well-being in that regard. But then if you measure well-being by eudaimonic well-being, which means flourishing or purpose, it's actually extremely beneficial because you're trying all of these different things, you're open to new things, you figure out what you want, what you like, what you'll stand for, what you won't, and that's a great way for figuring out your purpose, and which is really good for well-being, you know, having that sort of structure and a thing that you care about and acting on your principles. So yeah, like openness to, it's interesting that psilocybin is being used to treat depression and also has this effect on openness to experience, which also has an effect on well-being. But yeah, again, we don't really know exactly why. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done. It's just speculation at this point, any connection between things. So yeah, there's also a link between openness to experience and adaptability. Which makes sense. Now this might be a potentially sensitive topic, given the nature of this channel. So I'm going to try and be as respectful as I can talking about this. So this is something people can look up: is the homeostatic theory of subjective paranormal experiences, and essentially it suggests that paranormal beliefs, they provide us feelings of safety and control. So they found that people with childhoods where they experienced either parents who were very domineering or abusive, or just children who weren't really made to feel like they had a lot of control over their lives, were much likely to much more likely in later in life to have like paranormal beliefs and experiences.
And since there's no difference between magical and religious from the scientific point of view, we expect to have next generation more religion focused. I'm saying this because here in Brazil we are theocratic. So we are passing through this pandemic, and imagine the whole country, it has no food, it is isolated, and it's began to deliver their freedom to the authoritarians, and they will run to this experience that you said, that more religious, because they won't go to magic, they will go to Jesus.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we are expecting to getting worse in our situation.
Yes. Well, I mean that's So some of my research, I can touch on this briefly, but the more unstable and chaotic, the more likely people are to go towards these systems which offer them safety and control and order. I mean, even if the order, yeah, it might not be super great. But yeah, like, I mean, with the Abramelin, like, I can see how it can have some benefits, because it gives people long-term structure and order and purpose and meaning, like not just during the ritual, but like beyond the ritual itself. And all of those things are going to give you resilience and make life easier to deal with. And yeah, like I definitely think, I mean, there's definitely some connection between supernatural beliefs and more authoritarian traits, but I don't really know enough on that subject to talk about. Like, something I'm definitely interested in, but I can't really say I know a lot about with any authority. Yeah, so that's everything I have to. That's essentially the whole essay.
I'd like to say that was great news, but it's the worst news ever. But your contribution was fascinating. Just you figured out Brazil in your study.
Yeah, I mean,
because we are living through all this that. No, but it's science. It happens. Everything you say about this Abramelin, we are experiencing it firsthand in a global scale, about 200 million people. And we are experiencing everything you say about the authoritarian, the religious, and people are getting more angry, and we are in the verge of the civil war and everything. So for the people who are listening to this, you have to prepare yourself, brace yourself. Next years are going to get worse, I believe. Well, thank you so much for these insights, Richard. I'd like to ask you one last question that I ask to all religious people that we interview, but you are a man of science. So in your beliefs, what do you think happens after we die?
I don't know. I mean, like, science can only really answer questions about things that are testable, and the existence of God or what happens to us after we die isn't within that realm. So I mean, even though I'm a man of science, it doesn't mean that I don't believe.
What do you believe?
Well, I think in my bones, there's a perspective that, and I mean, this is pretty much like our sense of self is an illusion. Like our sense of who we are is a system in the brain called the default mode network. And when we disrupt that, our sense of self, of us in these bodies as these individuals, disappears. And we share 70% of our DNA with daffodils. Daffodils? Yeah, with flowers. And so, like, in many senses, my body as an individual might die, but me as in me, humanity, me as in life on this planet, me as in most of the DNA that I have is still shared within everything else. So it could even be that the very experience of consciousness itself is actually a singular thing, and me, the individual dying, doesn't really take away from that at all because it's still there. So I don't know if that really answers anything.
No, but there's no right or wrong answer. I've interviewed more than 190 people, and they all gave me different questions. It's most like we are betting. When we die, we will see who is right. But it was really, really great. I'd like to talk a little bit about your work in Instagram.
Oh yeah.
To use it as a meditation tool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have chronic pain, which is why I was interested in learning about well, how people deal and live with sort of through extreme circumstances, and how people build resilience. And yeah, for me, absolutely, I found drawing to be a meditative tool that sort of took me out of my body and focused my mind. And yeah, it was absolutely therapeutic. And I do very detailed geometric line drawings, very precise, very detailed, mostly by hand.
It takes a lot of time. How much time do you take for each one of those drawings?
Well, I mean, each of them is about A4 in size, and there'll be about an afternoon or two. And I have maybe more than 200 of those. So that's, yes. I mean, in terms of a body of work, I mean, all the things I have online, that isn't even all I have. But I've been since the last few weeks, I've been building an art gallery in virtual reality, nice. In Altspace. So if anyone has a VR headset, they can go and see my gallery. And there's a secret hidden room in that gallery, which I recommend people looking behind the picture of the face if they want to find it. I created some like miniature digital art experiences. You can still access it on a desktop without a VR headset, but I don't think it'll be as fun.
All right. You will give me this link. I will put this in the description also. So thank you so much for your time. It was a great interview. And thank you on behalf of the Brazilian people. I hope these insights would help us to cope with the pandemic a little better than we're doing right now. These insights about the Abramelin and the whole correlation with what we are passing through, I believe they will be of great help for us. Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a real honor to speak to you. I was really looking forward to this.
And if you need anything in your research from the Umbanda and the spiritual and stuff in the Brazilian, or any of the other interviews that I did with the religious people, just ask me and I will put them in contact.
Well, you know, I mean, I hope one day when things are back to normal and the world is less mad, I can visit you in person. That's what I'm hoping for.
Oh, it's great. I will take you to all this Umbanda you see in person and possessions and stuff like that. It would be great. You have a lot of friends here in Brazil.
Good to hear.
All right.
Were there any questions in the chat?
No, we have very few people today because since we are in London, we have this different time zones and everything is working.
Of course, yeah.
Everyone is working here, but they will surely watch this. If they have any questions, I will pass to you.
Yeah, sure thing.
Right. E para vocês que acabaram de ver a gente, então não esquece, segue o canal, dá o like, dá uma olhada nas outras entrevistas e a gente se vê no próximo Bate-Papo Mayhem.